Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Thursday, September 18th, 2025, the committee shall resume its study of Canadian energy exports. And I'd like to, on your behalf, welcome our witnesses from Export Development Canada. Alison Nankerville, welcome Alison, President and Chief Executive Officer. Guillermo Frere, pretty close, okay. Senior Vice President, Mid-Market Group. And from LNG Canada, virtually, we have Chris Cooper, President and Chief Executive Officer. And all virtual witnesses today. We have some on the next panel. They have been given their mandatory onboarding test and passed with flying colors. And our presenters now will have 5 minutes each for their opening remarks, after which we'll open the floor to questions and comments from members of Parliament. So, Ms. Nankerville, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and members of the committee, for inviting me here today. With me today is Guillermo Frere, Senior Vice President of our Mid-Market Group. We are pleased to contribute to your study on Canada's energy exports and to speak about the support that Export Development Canada provides to the sector. For those who may be less familiar with us, let me explain our mandate. We are part of Canada's international trade ecosystem. We support and grow Canada's export trade. We do this by providing straightforward solutions such as insurance, direct loans, and working capital. These solutions help companies manage risk, whether it's a new buyer, more international contracts, or establishing a foreign subsidiary.
Project finance teams in the country, which enable us to support domestic and international projects. And we offer that share of our trade knowledge and connections to companies we work with, and that we help to grow that knowledge through presence we have in markets both across the country and across the globe. We operate on commercial terms, which ensures that our work complements that of the private commercial banks and private insurers. Consistent with this model, EDC does not provide grants or subsidies. Since our inception more than 80 years ago, we've supported resource-based sectors that have long underpinned the Canadian economy. We recognize that energy, in particular, is a critical driver of our nation's wealth and prosperity, and that our support for the sector filters down to a robust ecosystem, which includes R&D, engineering services, advanced manufacturing, and clean technologies. In this moment of global uncertainty and shifting trade dynamics, we'll need to draw on the sector's strength to help build Canadian resilience, competitiveness, and economic security. In 2025 alone, EDC facilitated $18 billion of exports, foreign investment, and trade development activity in the energy and energy transition sectors. Over the last 5 years, we've facilitated $77 billion in business. These numbers encompass support for both conventional and clean energy sources, and the value chains that bolster them. Given the strong global imperative for energy security that exists today, and the opportunity this has created, we are focused on supporting Canada's industry in its full entirety. On the conventional energy side, we provided $2 billion in financing to the oil and gas sector in 2025, which represents a 73% increase over our 2024 levels. Support for this sector accounted for 7% of our overall business portfolio. With the recent increase supporting and reflecting some higher value transactions and a rise in global risk conditions for Canadian companies. Looking forward, we expect that our engagement with the oil and gas sector will continue to increase as EDC is called upon to support energy security around the globe. We're working with the Major Projects Office, for example, on some nation-building infrastructure projects that they have chosen to advance. On the clean energy side, in 2025, we provided $1.4 billion in financings to the renewables sector as part of our focus in supporting the global energy transition. In recent years, we've expanded our support in this space to include industries of strategic importance like nuclear technologies, carbon capture, utilization, and energy storage. While the pathway to a low-carbon economy continues to evolve, we remain committed to strengthening the competitiveness of Canadian exporters and the technologies that will enable this shift. Je vous remercie de m'avoir accordé le temps pour partager.
Thank you for giving me the time to share some information about EDC. I'm pleased to provide the committee with more information on what EDC is doing in the energy sector. This work helps Canada become more resilient, competitive, and secure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nankerville, and we are now going to go on to Mr. Cooper for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Chair, honourable members of the committee, on behalf of LNG Canada, thank you for the opportunity to input to your study on Canadian energy exports. LNG Canada Phase 1 provides a practical example for the issues you're considering, so please allow me to summarise across 5 areas. First, why Canadian energy exports matter at home. Canada has world-scale resources, a skilled workforce, and communities that can benefit from responsible resource development and long-term prosperity, including hundreds and thousands of direct and indirect jobs, durable careers in resource-dependent regions, Indigenous economic participation and revenue sharing, and public revenues that fund essential services at all levels of government. Natural gas, and LNG in particular, can expand Canada's reach beyond existing markets to global customers, increasing the value of our resources while critically diversifying trade. Phase 1 shows Canadian energy exports can be competitive, responsible, and aligned with public expectations. Second, Canada's role in global energy supply and what it takes to build export capacity. The global energy system is transitioning, but demand for reliable, responsible, and affordable energy will remain. Canadian LNG can help meet that demand by supporting stable energy markets, helping customers diversify away from higher risk or higher emitting sources, and providing energy governed by Canada's environmental, labour, and Indigenous rights frameworks. LNG projects do depend on long-term planning, regulatory certainty, and major investment across the value chain. Phase 1 shows Canada can permit, finance, and build this complex export infrastructure when conditions allow. Third, energy security in a more volatile world, and the case for Phase 2. This discussion is happening amid heightened geopolitical risk, supply chain disruption, and growing competition for secure and reliable energy. LNG importing countries are prioritizing reliability of supply, political stability of suppliers, and clear environmental and governance standards. As a democratic rules-based country with vast resources, Canada can support global energy security in ways that align with partners' values. Our exports are governed by predictable regulation, enforceable contracts, strong labour protections, and respect for Indigenous rights. LNG helps manage volatility by providing flexibility and diversification, especially in the Indo-Pacific, where demand is growing and energy security concerns are acute. Canadian LNG can help reduce dependence on less secure suppliers and, in many cases, enable a shift away from higher emitting fuels. For Canada, contributing to energy security abroad supports economic security at home. Jobs, investment, public revenues, and stronger trade relationships. That context underscores the strategic significance of expanding export capacity, including LNG Canada Phase 2, which is currently under consideration by LNG Canada's joint venture participants. Phase 2 would increase Canada's LNG export capacity using proven designs, established supply chains, while minimizing incremental impacts by building on what's already in place. For Canada, this is not only commercial, it's a strategic choice about whether global demand is met by Canadian energy or by others, whether Canada captures the jobs and investment benefits of its resources, and whether Canada remains relevant in an increasingly competitive global energy landscape. Fourth, barriers that could hold Canada back. Despite our advantages, Canada does have barriers to develop and export energy, including regulatory complexity and unpredictability, approval timelines that are long relative to global competitors, infrastructure constraints, and policy uncertainty that deters long-term investment. Major projects are planned over decades, policy stability, regulatory efficiency, and clarity on national energy objectives are critical to competitiveness. Phase 1 succeeded because governments, regulators, Indigenous partners, and investors aligned on both the importance of the project and the process to deliver it. Fifth, how we do this, Indigenous partnerships and responsible development. How development proceeds matters as much as if it proceeds. LNG Canada's model includes Indigenous nations as partners from the outset, including benefits agreements and equity participation, long-term revenue sharing, employment and skills development, and ongoing collaboration across the value chain. These partnerships represent durable economic participation in a meaningful contribution to reconciliation. Phase 2 would build on these relationships, expand benefits, and maintain the same commitment to consultation and collaboration. So in closing, Canadian energy exports matter to workers, communities, Indigenous nations, and Canada's place in the world, now more than ever. Phase 1 demonstrates what is possible when responsible development, Indigenous partnership, and global market access align. The question raised by our proposed Phase 2 expansion is whether Canada will fully realize its resource value in a rapidly evolving global energy system. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Our witnesses for those presentations. We're now going to go to questions and comments. We will start with Mrs. Stubbs for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all witnesses for being here. Mr. Cooper, I wonder if you could make some comments on the fact that since 2015, the Liberals have only approved 4 of 18 LNG projects proposed in Canada since they came to power. And of course, only the one that Conservatives enabled the federal provincial joint review of, which was LNG Canada 1, is being constructed. In that same time frame, the U.S. approved 26, 16 are built and operating, and the U.S. is now the world's lead LNG exporter, while Mexico is now poised to pass Canada, all in that same timeline. In general, as a proponent that is almost there, could you comment on why Canada is so far behind on exporting LNG that the world wants and needs, particularly with your comments on timely approvals, clarity and certainty in policy, and regulatory conditions for investors and proponents?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, first of all, I think the LNG Canada Phase 1, as I've said, is a good example of how to get it right. It's taken time and effort, that's for sure. And indeed, what we see in places like the US is a massive growth in LNG compared to other jurisdictions. We end up now in a position where about 60% of the LNG in the world comes from 3 locations: Australia, Qatar, and the US. And I believe that Canada could actually play a part. With Phase 2, we could actually add the cedar and wood fibre volumes and become a top 5 exporting nation. So I think Canada can put itself on the map in terms of the scale and being one of the top 5 contributors. In terms of what do we need from government and what helps progress those projects, I think the most important factors are policy certainty, regulatory predictability, and then competitive fiscal frameworks that recognize the scale and global competitiveness of LNG. It's about positioning yourself on the cost curve. And I think that's what's needed in terms of making these big investments go forward, attracting international foreign investment to make these big investments work. And so it's really about alignment of those interests. And then perhaps some streamlining on the consultation and the processes. So it's probably a simplification of the processes rather than a removal of the processes. Yeah, everybody else has processes. Ours just seem to be a little bit more complex. And I think what happened on Phase 1 is people aligned on the objective, and then they work through the process.
It seems clear that the federal government should move urgently to repeal or reform all their anti-development laws, policies, and regulations that they list in the back of C5, which they clearly indicate block building and stall proponents from getting major nation building projects done. Otherwise, they wouldn't have needed to pass Bill C5 and the MPO, but they should actually just fix the regulatory processes, make the permitting processes competitive with the world, especially our biggest competitors dictators and hostile regimes. You mentioned this, you're waiting to make that final investment decision for phase 2. If, to the extent that you can, could you advise what is holding LNG Canada back from making that final investment decision?
Yeah, sure. And indeed, to the extent that I can. So I would say it is just more process, right? So whilst we might point to processes in Canada, the investors also have processes. So I would say that things like the support that we've had by naming LNG Canada Phase 2 as a nation-building project, the support that we've had from the MPO in terms of helping us coordinate and drive forward on specific things that we needed assistance and alignment on, I think that's all falling into place. Now we start to move into a phase where we need the joint venture participants, the investors, to actually do their internal processes. So we're going through that at the moment. Obviously, 1 million questions from 5 different JVPs. So that's the process we're going through now. So I think nation building project, MPO support, now it's about investor alignment and going through those final steps of approvals, which also takes time.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And, you know, since Conservatives have consistently supported Canada aggressively pursuing the expansion of natural gas development at home and also LNG exports, we certainly do want to see the government make the conditions so that LNG Canada, too, can get quickly to a final investment decision. Since you mentioned the assistance and coordination of the MPO, maybe you could enlighten committee members a little bit about that. But also, I wonder if you can confirm whether or not a national security review has been done by the MPO since the referral, just given that PetroChina has a 15% interest in LNG Canada, and Conservatives, of course, support accelerating the development and exports of LNG, but we also support Canadian manufacturing and Canadian job creation. So could you let us know that status?
Yeah, sure. So I think in terms of MPO role, I think obviously, the primary sort of vehicle, if you like, in terms of enabling the nation building project objectives. So very supportive in that regard. Being, I would say, very accessible, very aligned in terms of understanding the needs of industry. So let's say a bit of a translator in terms of government and country need and trying to balance that with investor need. They've been very good at that.
Security review that the MPO is apparently responsible for being in charge of. Just also given the case that during phase 1 of LNG Canada, and again, we understand the cost pressures and the challenges for Canadian manufacturers, but of course Conservatives would prefer manufacturing supplies and components and jobs to come from Canadians, by Canadians, for Canadians. So given that the company did outsource the fabrication of 35 modules to China, I just wonder again, that because since when LNG Phase 2 was referred to the MPO, the lead contractor was already proposing fabrication yards in China. Again, could you give Canadians any assurance around the national security review that the MPO is tasked with performing everything needed to accelerate to a final investment decision on LNG Canada too?
Thank you. That's the time for this round, Mr. Cooper. Perhaps you could come back to that question with another speaker. We're going to go on to Mr. Gay for 6 months. 6 months. That would be great. We'll leave.
It's like a filibuster.
Yes.
A long filibuster.
We went through a 6-month filibuster in the last Parliament.
I don't know how Shannon would feel about
Mr. Gay for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup aux témoins.
Thank you very much to all our witnesses to be here this morning. It is very appreciated. Ms. Nankivel, I would like to ask you a question. We are very interested to know what kind of signal you are receiving from the various regions across the world and about the Canadian energy product and the demand for this product. Can you maybe let us know or shed a light on this? Can you share with us the international interest that you are seeing based on the various regions, please?
Thank you for the question. I think it's quite remarkable to say that I don't think Canada has seen a moment as it as now in terms of the interest in what Canada has to offer across a number of sectors, but particularly in the natural resources and the oil and gas sector. In our own dealings as a export credit agency, we have 26 offices abroad. We're in constant dialogue, both with our colleagues and international corporates out of Asia, out of Europe. And in fact, I just came off a panel talking with the German ambassador. And I would say I see extraordinary range of interest in Canada's natural gas. So my recent discussion I just had with the German ambassador, there is a lot of interest coalescing now around German corporates on how to think about engaging with as more of a coalition to deal with what could be the options for movement of natural gas up through Churchill to potentially have an option that way through to, and I believe there are discussions going on, but obviously not including EDC with that as an opportunity with the Manitoba government. But certainly in Asia, as I said, we have a fairly significant presence in Asia. In the discussions we've seen both with Japan, with Korea, obviously there's also been outside of our realm, but certainly I think ones with other countries as well. But those are the main ones where we've seen significant interest. And I would say that that is important to us because those are countries that we want to see collaboration on a much deeper level, not just about purchase offtake, but as EDC often have their export credit agencies come in and invest alongside us in financing the build out of those projects, as well as maybe having some of those international corporates be co-investors in the project alongside Canadian investors. So that is a discussion we're having underway. We see in some of the discussions we have more broadly with international groups with whom we're working on a number of files. But of course, the main negotiations for that aren't done with us. They are done with Natural Resources Canada. And so I would just say that from the point of view of looking at how the financing can come together, we are very much involved on that, working with those respective nations' export credit agencies.
Speaking of how the financing comes together, Mr. Cooper talked about the private sector. He talked about his project, the next step of LNG Canada being the private investor need to also follow their process. But I'm interested also the role of EDC. You talked about some foreign countries have similar organization, but how do you work jointly with the private sector, and how is EDC's role helping the private sector coalesce or participate in these energy export projects?
So thanks for the question. I think the way we work is, first of all, we have a 30-year history of financing these types of projects. And as I said, we have the largest project finance team in the country. Anything in respect to relations to these types of greenfield projects in general are done with export credit agencies, often working alongside the private sector. So when a sponsor or a group of sponsors get to the point where they have the sufficient equity and they're looking to how to make sure they can execute and go forward, generally at that point they come to Export Development Canada to explore what the financing package could look like. And as part of that discussion, it's for us, we start to take on our initial due diligence with our project finance team leading to look, is the sufficient balance between equity and debt is there? Is there the sort of offtake that we're looking for? There's a whole market feasibility offtake due diligence that's undertaken. I might let my colleague Guillermo speak a little bit to this because he has both before mid-market having had extensive experience in project finance. But I guess what I would say is that that is a dialogue that often starts for about a year in advance before we even get to the point of having financing, of saying what needs to be there in terms of offtake, investors around the table, are they sufficient, and then who is interested in partnering alongside with us. And generally speaking, when it is in our country, there's an expectation that EDC would lead that financing, and because we're so well respected globally in our ability to co-lead and lead syndications of project finance like this, there's a lot of willingness to partner with us. But I might turn to Guillermo in case you wanted to add something here.
Our time, unfortunately, is up for this round, but you can hold that thought and come back to it, and perhaps with another speaker. Monsieur Simard, 6 minutes.
Merci.
Mr. Simard, you have 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to make sure that our friends, the witnesses, are hearing the interpretation. Can they hear interpretation? Yes? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Terry. You're a champion. Thank you. So, quick question. Would you be able no, in fact, it's not a question. I'm going to ask you to give this committee sort of a distribution by province of the investment that EDC is doing. Could you please provide this to the committee? So what are you investing in Quebec, Alberta, BC? So maybe a distribution by province and also by energy sector, because I would like to understand better what is represented by, clean energy. And the reason I ask is because when I look at the documents that come from your organization, I see numbers that maybe are comforting myself in this impression that EDC is simply an organization that finances the oil and gas sector. I see in one of your reports $7.3 billion of support in 2023 for oil and gas, $9.3 billion in 2022, once again for oil and gas energy. And so here at the beginning of the session, you were talking about the investments you do in 2025. And you said it was $2 billion and it was an increase. So it's an increase compared to the reference year of 2024. But I mean, if we look at the past numbers, you have numbers that are absolutely stratospheric when it comes to the level of investment in oil and gas.
So maybe I'll start by first of all explaining when I reference to $2 billion, that is for financing. When we reference $9.3 billion, that is our support across a number of products, including a significant part of that is insurance. So when we have in Canadian oil and gas companies who are looking for protection against non-payment, that would include in that business. We would include contract bonding. And the other thing I think is really important to understand is our support is for the whole value chain. And if you look at EDC's business, most of our support outside of large projects we might be participating in is in the midstream companies who are in oil and gas services, equipment companies, engineering companies,
Oui.
technology companies.
Merci. C'est quand même un avantage non négligeable qui est donné à l'industrie. Et je vous dis ça parce que je serais curieux.
This is a non-negligible advantage that you are giving the industry. And I'm curious because I want to know about your investment in the energy sector in Quebec. Last week, we had the Hydro-Quebec people came, and maybe they never came to you for a request, but they said that the two energy exploitation project that they have toward New York and Massachusetts, there is not a single dollar coming from the federal government for that. But if I look at the big project of the West that are with oil, I see a lot of different forms of financial assistance, and you just talked about it, coming from EDC, and I find this to be a contradiction, and I'm going to explain to you, because the four largest players in oil and gas belong 60% to American interest, and in a reference period of 2021 to 2024, they got 131 billion of profits. And in this, there were record, $90 billion that were sent. So maybe I don't understand quickly, why aren't they simply reinvesting in their own facilities? Why aren't they supporting the supply chain in the gas sector? Why is it EDC that has to do it when they have record profit? I cannot understand this kind of dynamics, which is why I have an interest in you showing me the distribution of your investment in, according to provinces. I want to see if there is an inequity, particularly in the energy sector, because I also see in some of your reports that you are definitely supporting clean energy for oil and gas. So when you do your distribution of funding, do you consider this clean energy investments, or are you doing investment in the oil and gas sector? So I think it would be very important for the understanding of the committee to have this kind of information.
We can certainly come back to you with the distribution. Actually, I would tell you that our distribution of support across the country is relatively even. And I would certainly point to the fact that we're actually one of the largest financiers of clean tech in Canada, and that has continued to grow alongside any support we do.
Entendez par clean tech. Est-ce que c'est des...
What do you mean clean tech? Are you talking about capture of the carbon capture and storage, or are you talking about clean energy like wind and sun and hydroelectricity?
One's related to alternatives to traditional energy. On the energy management side of technology, it also relates to areas to do with clean technology related to water. I mean, it goes across. Our definition is quite broad.
Je vais vous poser une question qui peut paraître banale.
This might be a simple question, but for you, are oil and gas with a technology of carbon capture, do you consider this to be clean energy?
We consider technology, CCUS, to be part of clean technology initiatives, yes, but not necessarily the traditional part of that connected to it, no.
Your time, Mr. Tucker, for 5 minutes.
Much to think about liquefied natural gas, and you're hearing today that the MPO has been, if Mr. Cooper, through your testimony, you won't confirm that or deny that they're doing the national security review. But what does the MPO do for you?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So first of all, I think starting as I said earlier, just getting clarity on naming LNG Canada Phase 2 as a nation-building project, that sends a strong signal to the international community, these investors. In terms of the MPO themselves, then they start to become what I'd describe as maybe a broker, a translator, to try and sort of help with the interfaces with government. So if I talk to my investors on what do you actually need to go forward, then actually they can come up with a list of things, and it's all about affordability and competitiveness.
Will they set up an office so that office would interact with other bureaucrats in Ottawa? So it's another layer of bureaucrats trying to make it work for private industry, it sounds like. And on the national security review, we know a large percent of Phase 1 was Chinese built. I would assume, and get your comment, if the national security review is done on Phase 2, that we would be excluding large components from China so that we're built, Canada strong.
Yeah, so I would say, MPO brings a focus in terms of a sort of place that we can actually focus on many, many departments. So you're right, there are, as I said, many departments, many parts of government to talk to, many stakeholders. That's part of the
Canada has a long history of exporting nuclear technology, and EDC has played a central role, I would say, in that. And for the most part up to today, it has been the CANDU reactor. Is EDC working to ensure Canada is part of the global AP1000 supply chain? Yes or no? Great. So how does one help ensure that supply chain is in Canada versus our current model with the CANDU?
So actually, we are very focused. One of the big things we're doing at EDC is mapping out the value chains that are in Canada and making sure that they can continue to scale through financing their growth as their OEMs they're working with grow. Because that's the biggest problem of how we lose Canadian participation in supply chains. The supply chain doesn't grow as the opportunity grows. So financing that is really critical, but in a number of supply chains, not just nuclear. So we're spending time on that. We're also trying to make sure growth capital is available to them, because otherwise what we have seen happen is sometimes U.S. groups will come up and acquire them because that technology is so strong. And that is something we're very concerned about, which is why we're so focused on ensuring that alternative sources of growth capital are available to them.
Just to clarify, you're concerned that American companies would come up and take over some of those companies that have the technology in the nuclear industry?
Yes, our concern is that in doing that, that they don't have the opportunity to continue to scale in Canada, as opposed to have the company's growth further happen in the United States. Whereas we will work and have obviously worked with a lot of companies that are foreign owned, and that's not our issue. Our issue is just making sure that the capital is there to available to allow the plant or the operations in Canada to grow.
No, but you're not financing growth in American companies that work in the nuclear sphere. Are you proposing that?
No, what we're proposing is that we work with Canadian companies so they don't have to go to the U.S. to find capital.
And along the same lines, are you aware of what the government is doing at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, outsourcing to an all-American consortium of companies, Canadian employees for sure, but owned by American companies to take over our Canadian nuclear labs?
I am not aware of that, and that's sort of outside the realm of EDC, so I'm afraid I don't have much to comment on that.
But you wouldn't, if EDC was concerned about the theft of our intellectual property in current Canadian operations that you would finance, would that be one of the things you would flag if it was a foreign-owned company?
Well, I mean, I think what we recognize is supply chains have a lot of different ownership in them. Our goal is when companies show that they want to scale and remain Canadian, we provide the financing to enable that to happen.
And could I, just one question back on the different reactors that you're working with. I understand, would you have met with Westinghouse in the last 12 months to discuss how EDC could help?
And a quick answer, please.
I am not aware that we have. I'd have to get back to you on that.
You also tabled if you met with Brookfield during the same time period.
Okay.
All
right, time.
Well, we have a fairly broad activity with Brookfield that does nothing
you.
necessarily do with
Thank you
facilities,
both.
so I'd have to get back to you on that.
Thank you both. Mr. Hogan, you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. It is great to have you all here today. This is an important conversation, and you bring an expertise that will inform a report that I think we're all very excited about, because we do see the opportunities.
Hang on, Mr. Hogan. Folks, there's a lot of noise coming from this side of the table, occasionally from that side of the table, but if we could just, if you do speak with one another, whispers, please, or go away from the table. Thank you. Mr. Hogan, we stopped your time.
Okay, well, thank you, Chair. So I'll just jump right into the questions. Ms. Nankerville, EDC provides support on commercial terms. You regularly interact with capital, both domestic and international. So your insights are very important to this committee because you see opportunities both present and that are evolving in the market, and you have a great sense of the market. So can you expand on your views, short, middle, and longer term, of trends in energy exports that this committee should be mindful of?
So I think one of the things that for us that we're seeing in terms of energy exports is a need for us to think of Canada's positioning not just as an exporter of commodities, but an exporter of energy solutions and the full value chain around that. That is something that we're very concerned about, because we believe that the competitiveness of exports of energy do not come without having the rest of that value chain associated with that. And as I'd said before, you cannot scale up an industry if you don't have the requisite equipment, technologies, and engineering know-how to go with it. So that is something we're very focused on. The other thing that I think is important to understand is, and this is something when I first joined at EDC, I spent a lot of time out west having this discussion directly, and I've had it with energy and related technology companies in the energy value stream elsewhere, is it's the mid-market where the gap is, which is why we're so focused on financing that gap, because there are fewer choices. The upstream is relatively well serviced by the commercial industry of all large sectors. And actually, Hydro-Quebec is one of those areas that's been so well financed, they haven't needed us, which is why it's been as harder necessarily for us to always balance in terms of large. We spend a lot of time working with the medium and the small. The third thing I would say is there's a huge transition going on where many companies involved in the energy value chains are not just involved in conventional energy, they're involved in transition and renewable energies. And they're moving quite quickly to having adjacencies in their business. So, for example, if you're an expert in drilling in oil and gas, you're probably also an expert in drilling for geothermal. And you're now building new businesses in that area, which are becoming of great demand of Canadian services in places like Indonesia or in Europe, where that geothermal is replacing for district heating. We're seeing that in other sectors, energy, traditional energy to hydrogen, renewable fuels. The monitoring and the know-how we have when we have drilling in holes, that monitoring is being used across a number of value chains now. And those are the companies that we say are important for creating energy systems and energy solutions that we're looking to export globally.
Thank you. And of course, globally, 2 out of every $3 is going to green energy. So certainly a market that Canada wants to be on top of. And it's great to hear that our conventional expertise is so portable. Mr. Cooper, one of the things the MPO is charged with is taking the learnings from its work into the broader regulatory framework. And you talked about simplifying rather than lowering a standard. I think that's something this whole committee can get excited about. Those are kind of zero-cost wins. And you've emphasized the importance of long-term partnerships with Indigenous nations. So I'm just wondering if you can expand on where you think there are opportunities for reforms or rationalizations and just, ensuring that we are walking a stronger path of reconciliation while still, meeting this nation-building moment. And I say well still, but that's not even fair because these things are not at odds, but how they can unlock nation-building moments.
Yeah, if I just use phase 1 versus phase 2 as just one simple example. When we came into phase 1, we put in place the usual impact and benefit agreements with the various First Nations, both on the pipeline and on the plant. Our agreements cover both phase 1 and phase 2. So it would have been quite easy to just stop there and say that's us done. But since phase 1 was taken investment decision in 2018, we have things like UNDRIP and much more sort of development and, let's say, maturing of our understanding under truth and reconciliation. So on phase 2, what we've done is we've taken those impact and benefit agreements. We put billions of dollars into phase 1 in local and Indigenous contracts, apprenticeships, training of people, etc. And we've actually doubled down on that in phase 2 by meeting the IBA commitment that we made in 2018, but also then exploring equity opportunities to actually bring in the First Nations into phase 2 in a meaningful way that goes beyond phase 1, which we didn't really need to do. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to be doing, whether that's facilitated through government or through industry. I think that's the Canadian way, and that's what we're doing.
Thank you both. Monsieur Sima, 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.
Les plus tarifés présentement.
One of the sectors this is the softwood lumber sector. And so with the combination of anti-dumping and tariffs, it means about 40%. So does the EDC have an action plan on this? In this context?
Softwood was one of the sectors that was covered through our Trade Impact Program that was launched in March of last year, which is a $5 billion program of support over 2 years to help those sectors that are most impacted. So we do see that with softwood being one, aluminum another, some areas of manufacturing. In softwood, where we've been really instrumental, is continuing to support through that impact program longer buyer terms, actually putting bonding in place to support so that Canadian softwood producers who have to pay tariffs, we will fund the posting of those tariff bonds, which actually would otherwise be a draw on their working capital and make them unable to really afford to continue to transact business. So we are providing a guarantee to the bank frees up capital, and therefore the bond that has to be put up, we're effectively guaranteeing of those tariff bonds, and that significantly has helped.
J'ai suivi ça de très près et je peux vous dire que ça...
Yes, I followed this very closely, and I can tell you that it was received very positively by the sector and very complicated.
Vous allez pouvoir nous déposer.
And perhaps the documents that you'll be able to provide with us will put an end to this impression, but I have the impression that the support that you're providing to the oil and gas sector has nothing to do with the support provided to the forestry sector, and that's why I want to have a breakdown of the structural investments that you're making, because I still have this impression that EDC is making structural investments in the energy sector, but not in Quebec, because you mentioned this. There's not much demand from Hydro-Quebec, so you're making structural investments in industries outside of Quebec, but in our industries, when we have one-time needs, like in the context of the current softwood issue, the EDC's answer
Et c'est ce que je...
not up to the challenge. And so that's what I've been seeing since the beginning of this crisis, and that gives me the impression
gazier pétrolier qu'à d'autres...
only applies or to the oil and gas sector as opposed to other sectors.
Mr. Rowe, 5 minutes.
All righty, thank you. My first question is for Mr. Cooper with LNG Canada. LNG is a big topic in Atlantic Canada and all through Canada. We just seen that we have imports of LNG into Atlantic Canada, which is very strange considering the abundance of natural gas right across this country. In Alberta, northern Canada, there's actually natural gas in people's water supply. So, we've got an abundance of there. I was in Alberta, we're selling our natural gas for less than 5 cents a unit. It goes to the States in a pipeline and gets sold, liquefied, and sold for over $12 as LNG. So I find it hard to believe that there's no case for offshore. Germany came to Newfoundland a few years back. The Liberal government met with the Germans and said, "Hey, there's no business case for offshore liquid natural gas." I find that hard to believe. Would you be able to expand on that and make a little bit sense for me as quickly as you can? And I've got a few more questions to get to, but I just try to make some sense of that argument.
Yeah, very simple version of that. I've done these investments in Nigeria, Oman, Australia. I've done onshore, offshore. So I'm sort of, I understand this stuff. The big challenge with LNG investments is competitiveness, affordability, placing them on the right place on the cost curve. Onshore facilities come with their own challenges, and they're hard enough. Offshore facilities as well. Making the economics of those work with these very large vessels can be a challenge. So I think it's doable. I agree with you. There's an absolute abundance of gas here. There's a massive opportunity here, but it's about streamlining policy and aligning the different stakeholders around that investment and then working together to make it competitive, or it will not go ahead. Capital will go overseas.
You mentioned policy certainty now previously with Shannon and again. Do you think that the barriers that are killing the competitiveness are our own barriers, whether that's overregulation of C69, Bill C69, or the, major investment risks of Bill C49, or just Canadians' overregulation in general? And this current Liberal government has proven that our economy is overregulated because they said we need to bring in C5 so they could mow over those regulations. So do you kind of agree with what the Liberal stance is now, that we are overregulated and that's why hasn't been a business case for LNG in this country?
I can see it both ways. I think that, to be fair, the regulations that you have in Canada are amongst the most stringent in the world. So that leads to really good outcomes on carbon, let's say methane emissions and things like that. So it has a very, very good place. And that's actually seen as a differentiator and a positive to investors overseas as they look to decarbonize. The flip side of that is it can really slow things down. And then that erodes your competitiveness. And by the time you've actually aligned, the investment's gone elsewhere. So I think it's really about asking the question, do we want to put all the layers of regulation and policy in place and then ask what an investment looks like, and by which time it's gone? Or do we want to say, this is the investment we want, now how do we need to streamline policy and interests around that to make that investment work? And I think the latter is probably the pathway for us to take.
I understand what you're saying. We've seen it both ways, and there's a lot of thought that goes in that. And I think that if the world really wanted to have very, highly regulated, carbon neutral facilities, then it would make it even more case, and we would see trillions of dollars flooding into Canada's economy. We'd see these projects going up, but we're not seeing that. What the world says they want, what they really want, is two different things, because we're seeing investment in the United States and other countries except for Canada. And going forward, should we take should we pipeline our natural gas from Alberta and into Atlantic Canada, where we can take our importing facility and modify it to be an export facility, or should we continue with the status quo of where we're going?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. You don't see the market giving a premium for low carbon LNG at this point in time. Now, whether that comes in the future, who knows? It's about future resilience as well. But I do agree that, if you look at the amount of gas that Canada has, to not have a pretty meaningful LNG industry is sort of questionable. I think we missed it maybe the first time round. We've got the opportunity the second time round. The question is, can we align our policies and simplification to make it happen? I think we are on phase one, phase two. That's a start. I think there's a significantly bigger opportunity. And the revenues and benefits that brings to the country are immense, and they can be redistributed into other things quite well, including investments in offshore infrastructure and also in clean tech.
Appreciate your wisdom on this, and we're going to continue. Conservatives are going to continue fighting for the LNG sector, especially in offshore Newfoundland and Labrador, where it's big potentials. And we look forward to getting your insight, perhaps at another committee date. So thank you for your wisdom.
Thank you both. Wrapping up this panel, Mr. Clark, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here this morning and for this very interesting conversation. Mr. Cooper, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions on LNG in general. I think one of the values, there are many, but one of the great values of LNG is we can see it in some ways as a transition or mid-tier fuel source between traditional higher-emitting fossil fuels and before the point that massive large-scale renewables come online across the country. So what is your perspective on LNG role and potential in Canada as an export in general and kind of that transition or phase for our country?
Yeah, so I think if you kind of just go to some of the studies that you see from various companies, there's no disputing now that LNG is a growth sector. We're currently about 400, in round numbers, 400 million tonnes per annum. Growth in that through to the end of the decade, another 30% growth, another 25% on that to the end of 2040, takes you to around about 700 million tonnes. So that's a debate that people are no longer having. There is a clear demand for LNG. In terms of how that fits in as a transition fuel, let's say, I think we're all working out the energy transition is not linear. I think we wish it was, but it's not. And I think that's where LNG can play a part in terms of being a good cousin, if you like, or a partner to solar, wind. When the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, gas will always be there. I think that's what our international partners are seeing. If you look at Canada's place in that, I think, as I said, it's got one of the most stringent regulatory regimes around carbon that exists. And I think that could potentially be a benefit later. But it does position Canada among the lowest emitters. Carbon intensity is typically 0.14 to 0.4 in LNG, and LNG Canada is at the bottom end of that, 0.145. So we are displacing coal, we are displacing oil, and LNG emits something like 20 to 30% less carbon than oil, and something like 40 to 50% less carbon than coal. And your international trade partners see that, and that builds international trade, which then got broader spin-off benefits. So I think LNG is a fuel. It's an opportunity for Canada with the abundance of gas, but it's also an access pathway in terms of energy transition to help trading partners, which then leads to broader global trade. So it really enables significantly more for Canada than just a fuel.
I think that's very well said. And being an MP from Nova Scotia, we're, the only province in this country that is still reliant to a significant degree on coal as a fuel source. So your points are well taken on the advantages of LNG as compared to coal. Absolutely. I wanted to ask a question about a provision that was in the budget introduced last fall around capital cost allowances for LNG facilities, ranging from 10 to 50%, depending on the facility and the use and the carbon intensity of the LNG. Mr. Cooper, if you could just give us your thoughts on those proposals, capital cost allowances, and where we can continue to incentivize the right type of LNG opportunities in Canada.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to kind of maybe some of the first points that were made around MPO, etc. You know, it's really about just getting together and saying, okay, what are these investors? How do these investors internationally look at these LNG investments? They are huge outlays of capital. They are huge risk, and these investors have choices elsewhere. There are plenty of places where you can actually build LNG, and Qatar, Australia, and the US Gulf Coast are seen as, let's call them safe havens established. So it's really then about establishing the competitiveness and the risk profile that then goes into those investors' economic decks. So, of course, accelerated capital cost allowance is something that then plays into how they run their numbers and their internal rate of return, which is how they'll look at these investments. So things like accelerated capital cost allowance is one of the discussions that that we've had through the MPO, where government can actually help create the right conditions for investment climate. And I think that's the kind of dialogue that perhaps has been missing in the past. We got some of that on phase one. I think that really we're not looking for special favors on phase two or in LNG in general. We're looking for mechanisms that enable competitiveness and affordability. And the accelerated capital cost allowance is a good example of that.
As was mentioned earlier, you can't divulge anything about your final investment decision beyond maybe what you mentioned earlier, but is it fair to say that what we're just talking about, accelerated CCAs, at least makes things clearer from a FID decision-making process when you're dealing with a massive, complicated project like Phase 2?
Thank you. Thank you.